Pilot Kaneyoshi Muto was surrounded by a dozen American F6F Hellcats. There was no room to run. It would be him or them. The Americans closed in, confident of an easy victory. But as their guns opened, the wings on Muto's aircraft appeared to transform. Suddenly, the aircraft snapped into a blinding high G turn. Tracers streaked past empty air as the Japanese fighter danced through the hail of fire. U.S. airmen could barely keep up. Muto was no more than a speck ahead of them. Then they lost him completely. The Americans looked around, confused. Out of nowhere, Muto was back, right off their wings, cannons locked on target. Muto struck. One Hellcat spiraled down in flames as a second one exploded. The U.S. pilots tried to regroup, but as they did, 2 more fighters collapsed. The rest broke formation and fled. For a moment, the Japanese dared to hope. Even as their empire crumbled, a new weapon had just taken flight, one fast, agile, and lethal enough to win back the Pacific. The N1K George was here. Flying Clan. In the 1930s, as Hitler prepared to unleash his iron-winged Luftwaffe across Europe, another storm was brewing in the east. The Empire of Japan was rapidly forging an air force designed not just to defend its islands, but to dominate an entire continent and bring the Pacific into its imperial domain. Year after year, Japanese engineers unveiled better, faster, and more far-reaching aircraft, each one a weapon meant to project terror far beyond Japan's shores. Among them was the Nakajima A-4N, a carrier-based biplane fighter deployed in packs. These aircraft strafed enemy ships until they were burning wrecks, then mercilessly raked the lifeboats with machine gun fire. When the Japanese needed to take their destruction even further, they would deploy their Mitsubishi G3M bombers, which, with their astonishing long range of 2,700 miles, could bring devastation to cities that had once believed themselves safe from the Empire's fury. Emboldened by this new arsenal, Japan wasted no time, and in 1937, it launched a full-scale campaign against China. By September, the skies above Shanghai had become a hunting ground. Squadrons of Japanese bombers rained destruction upon the city's factories, neighborhoods, and military outposts, while also providing cover for the amphibious landings that soon brought Japanese ground forces right to the city's doorstep. From battered airstrips, Chinese pilots and a small group of American volunteers rushed to intercept them in their aging Curtiss Hawks and Boeing B-26P shooters. But the skies now belonged to the Japanese. Formations of Mitsubishi A-5Ms, the world's first low-wing monoplane fighter, cut through the Chinese formations with their twin 7.7mm machine guns. Dogfights quickly spread all over the city. Chinese aircraft fell in droves. Those that survived could barely limp back to base. The aerial onslaught, synchronized with ground and naval assaults, brought mighty Shanghai to its knees in just over 3 months. In the span of a decade, Japan had forged one of the most lethal air forces on Earth. Welcome to the fight. Despite the rapid consolidation of its formidable aerial fleet, Japan remained unsatisfied. As the 1930s drew to a close, the Imperial Japanese Navy began looking for a next-generation fighter, one that could take the destructive legacy of the Mitsubishi A-5M and push it even further. The new aircraft would have to be a marvel of engineering, capable of climbing to 9,800 feet in under 10 minutes, reach 310 miles per hour, remain airborne for up to 8 hours, and pack enough firepower to overwhelm any opponent in the skies. Many engineers were stunned. Such a fighter seemed impossible, even for one of the world's most advanced aviation powers. But one man believed otherwise. In 1939, after months of radical innovation and weight-saving breakthroughs, Jiro Horikoshi, Mitsubishi's chief designer, unveiled the first prototype of what would soon become a name feared across the world, the A6M-0. The Zero entered combat trials over China in 1940 and stunned even its creators. In an engagement over the central city of Chongqing, a formation of 13 Zeros tore into a Chinese fighter force, reportedly downing 27 enemy planes, without suffering a single loss. While some dismissed the numbers as inflated propaganda, it was undeniable that Japan had built one of the best fighters on the planet. Early combat reports credited the Zero with a kill ratio of 12-1. But the Zero wasn't built for short-range skirmishes. With its exceptional range and endurance, it was designed to carry Japan's war across continents, and that's exactly what it did. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the United States saw Japan's devastating aerial power up close. Over 400 Japanese aircraft swept toward Pearl Harbor in a coordinated pre-dawn strike. Among the first wave were dozens of Zeros. Their machine guns immediately began strafing American airfields. P-36 Hawks, P-40 Warhawks, and even B-17 Flying Fortresses were destroyed before their engines could turn over. Explosions lit the runways as fuel tanks ignited and aircraft were torn apart in seconds. A few American pilots managed to take off from the runway, but once airborne, they found themselves outmatched. Around their heavier American counterparts, Japanese pilots exploited the superior maneuverability and firepower, downing American planes almost at will. When the attack finally ended, America was left bleeding. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, battleships crippled, and hundreds of aircraft destroyed. It was the worst aerial strike in American history to that point. All that the nation had left were scattered fragments of a few downed Zeros, the only clues America had to understand how to defeat this monster. A worthy opponent. After America officially entered the Pacific War, officials were fully aware they could not defeat the Japanese in the air. If the U.S. Navy wanted a chance at survival, let alone victory, it needed a fighter that could hunt Japan's top assassin. For months, American engineers worked to push the limits of design and manufacturing. Then, at last, they presented Navy aviators with a weapon they believed could turn the tide: the Grumman F6F Hellcat. Powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the Hellcat could outrun, outclimb, and outfight the Zero at altitude. Its armored cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks allowed it to soak up punishment that would have turned a Zero into a flaming wreck. When the Hellcat first entered service over the Gilbert Islands in late 1943, the change was immediate. Suddenly, the Predator became the prey. The Zero still held an edge in low-speed turning fights, forcing Hellcat pilots to avoid prolonged dogfights at close quarters. Into the thin air above the Pacific, the Zero's nimbleness began to fade, and the Hellcat's raw power took over. In savage engagements across the Gilberts, entire squadrons of Zeros were torn from the skies. Reports spoke of up to 30 Japanese fighters falling in a single campaign. Japan's long-nurtured aerial supremacy, built over years of experience in China and the early Pacific campaigns, was collapsing. Faced with this aerial bloodbath, Japan's only hope was to respond in kind. But designing a new fighter in the midst of a war, with Allied bombers hammering aircraft factories night after night, seemed impossible. The answer, the Japanese realized, was not to start from scratch, but to evolve an existing design into a machine that could face the Hellcat head-on. That design was the Kaneyoshi N1K. Originally envisioned as an armed floatplane fighter to support Japan's amphibious offensives across the Pacific, where no runways existed, the N1K had been born for a different kind of war. The first version, the Kyofu, took flight in 1942, but Japan's war strategy was already shifting by that point. Now, on the defensive, the Japanese Navy had little use for floatplanes. Kaneyoshi engineers had already begun work on a land-based version, and now it had become a national priority. Powered by a Nakajima NK9A Homare 11 engine, the new N1K1J Shiden promised greater speed and heavier firepower than the Zero. But there were harsh trade-offs. The rush production left Homare engines prone to mechanical failures, and the N1K's tall, fragile landing gear suffered from heat stress and frequent collapse. Yet Japan was out of time and out of options. Despite its flaws, the Navy ordered the N1K1J into production. It would not be a perfect fighter, but in the face of the rising Hellcat threat, it would have to be enough. George. After a series of design setbacks and delays, the first Shiden finally rolled off Japanese assembly lines and took to the skies in 1944. The final iteration of this machine mounted a four-bladed propeller nearly 11 feet wide, which, driven by its 1,990 horsepower engine, hurled the fighter to speeds of up to 355 miles per hour. For firepower, Kaneyoshi engineers provided the Shiden with 4 20mm Type 99 Model 2 Mark IV cannons. Backing these up were 2 77mm Type 97 machine guns, giving the Shiden a brutal punch in both long-range volleys and close-range dogfights. When the Shiden first entered combat, American pilots took immediate notice. Intelligence quickly assigned it the codename George. Over the Philippines, as U.S. forces advanced to liberate the islands, furious dogfights erupted once again, the kind of aerial duels that American pilots had hoped were behind them upon surpassing the Zeros. As American carrier aircraft launched bombing raids, close air support, and ground attack missions, they were repeatedly ambushed by squadrons of Shidens rising from Japanese airfields. In the chaos of these battles, the Georges reportedly shot down more than 40 American planes, their heavy cannons blasting bombers and fighters alike. Emboldened by their success, Japanese commanders accelerated Shiden production. Over 1,000 of these fighters were eventually built. Many rushed to the defense of Taiwan and the southern reaches of Japan, where Shiden pilots went on to claim more victories. Yet, for all its promise, the N1K1J was not the war-winning weapon Japan so desperately needed. For beneath its ferocious exterior lay inherited flaws that no amount of armament could fully erase. One of the most glaring was its legacy as a float plane. The Shiden's wing remained mid-mounted on the fuselage, a holdover from the aircraft's original design that had required room for a central float beneath the airframe. Now, with the float replaced by retractable landing gear, the Shiden required a tall, slender, and fragile undercarriage to keep its massive propeller clear of the ground. This made every landing a risk. Even veteran pilots knew their Shidens might survive an entire sortie untouched by enemy fire, only to crumble fatally on landing. Still, the N1K1J was sent into battle time and again, each sortie a desperate attempt to slow the American advance and buy the Empire a few more weeks, or even days of survival. Shiden Kai. Just as Japan's aerial hopes were on the verge of collapse, a new contender finally arrived, the most recent version of the N1K, fortified and built to correct the fatal flaws of its predecessor. The Japanese had begun work on an updated version of the George almost as soon as the original fighter first took flight. This new machine would be known as the N1K2J Shiden Kai, or George Kai to the Americans. The road to the Kai was turbulent. Development dragged on as engineers worked under the crushing weight of Japan's collapsing aerospace industry. Japanese designers had to find a way to build a more agile and faster fighter while relying on dwindling stockpiles of parts. Their solution was to strip away hundreds of pounds of excess weight, chopping about 550 pounds from the airframe and eliminating complex components that could no longer be sustained. The result was a leaner, faster aircraft that could reach an estimated 370 miles per hour. Still, not everything could be improved. The Nakajima Homare 11 engine, powerful but unreliable, remained due to the inability to create a more refined version during the last years of the war. The Shiden Kai would have to fight with this imperfect heart. But in all other respects, the fighter was promising. The airframe was lengthened, and the tail was completely redesigned for greater stability. Most critically, the awkward mid-mounted wings of the N1K1J were finally lowered. With that change came a sturdier, shortened landing gear. But the most revolutionary addition to the Shiden Kai was a tiny technological upgrade, the Mercury switch. Simple in design, yet devastating in effect, this sensor automatically responded to sudden shifts in airspeed or G-forces. In the heat of battle, when the aircraft hit a sharp turn or a high G maneuver, the Mercury switch would instantly deploy the combat flaps of the wings, adjusting their angles dynamically. In the blink of an eye, the Shiden Kai would gain extra lift and avoid dangerous stalls. The difference in combat was staggering. American pilots quickly discovered that the Shiden Kai could pull turns that seemed almost impossible. The fighter could roll sharply, snap into a hard bank, and appear in the blind spot of any American aircraft, even the mighty Hellcat or F4U Corsair. And yet, for all its promise, the Shiden Kai was up against an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat. It wasn't until 1945 that Japan's last great fighter entered the skies. By then, the Empire's industrial base was shattered, and Japan could barely produce a few hundred Shiden Kais, while the US was fielding swarms of Hellcats and Corsairs, each numbering over 12,000 units. Faced with this imbalance, Japan knew that the only way they would have a fighting chance was to ensure that each Shidenkai that took off was flown by the best pilots, skilled enough to exploit every ounce of this fighter's raw potential and make American airmen fear them once again. Dream Team. After months of air battles over the Philippines, Japan's veteran pilots had been cut down in droves, and replacements lacked the skill and experience to face America's increasingly dominant air power. Desperate to reclaim the skies, the Japanese Navy turned to Captain Minoru Genda, the ruthless flight officer who was known by many as one of the masterminds behind the strike on Pearl Harbor. Now, Genda was tasked with one final mission: to form an elite strike force that could defeat the Americans. Scouring the shattered ranks of Japan's air forces, Genda handpicked the most lethal survivors, aces who had fought their way through the skies over China, the Solomons, and the Philippines. They would become the 343rd Naval Air Group, Japan's last great aerial sword. Among them was Kaneyoshi Muto, a legend among pilots. His comrades called him, quote, a genius in the air. Muto had been key in some of Japan's most critical campaigns, from securing the skies of China to helping conduct the raids over American airfields in the Philippines following Pearl Harbor. In the war's final months, the 343rd unleashed these fighters, equipped with the N1K2J Kai alongside standard Shiden and lightning-fast Nakajima C6N reconnaissance planes. Muto was among the first to wield this new blade against the enemy. One day, flying in formation with aging Zeros and muscular J2M Raidens, his patrol spotted a flight of Grumman F6F Hellcats taking off from a distant carrier. The Americans closed in fast, confident that their rugged Hellcats would shrug off Japanese fire, just as they had so many times before. The opening Japanese volleys sparked off the Hellcats' armored skins. But then the battle began to shift. Whenever an American locked onto a target, the Shidenkai slipped away with unnatural grace. Pilots witnessed Japanese aircraft appearing, vanishing, and pivoting impossibly within seconds. Muto maneuvered hard, forcing his Shiden through a screaming high-G turn. He brought the big 4 20mm Type 99 cannons to bear and unleashed a burst. The first Hellcat was shattered under the torrent of the Japanese fighters. Then another. American pilots tried to regroup, but by the time they adjusted, 2 more Hellcats were spiraling into the sea. 4 Hellcats gone. Not a single Japanese aircraft was lost. When the stunned American survivors rushed back to their carrier, they reported a new aerial hunter had been unleashed, one faster, deadlier, and more slippery than any aircraft they'd fought against. Back in Japan, the legend of the encounter spread like wildfire. Newspapers hailed Muto and his Shidenkai as the lone heroes who had carved through the American formation, returning without so much as a scratch. The story grew with each retelling, transforming Muto into a near-mythic figure, the ace who had defied impossible odds in the skies aboard the most capable aerial fighter the world had ever seen. The last great adversary. During the following weeks, the 343rd National Air Group gave itself to the task of hunting for fresh targets its Shidenkai fighters could strike. By March 18th, a Japanese C6N reconnaissance plane spotted a massive formation of American warships steaming toward the home islands. Carriers bristling with fighters and bombers meant to crush the nation's final defenses. But the Japanese pilots could not let this force pass unchallenged. Even though they were outnumbered, they would take to the fight. Inside the cockpits of their Shidenkais, they felt invincible. At dawn on March 19th, the order was given. Shidenkais headed straight toward the American formation. They were met by a storm of nearly 300 American aircraft barreling toward them. As the two formations collided, 2 fighters smashed into each other mid-flight, sending out a violent burst of flame and shrapnel that forced nearby pilots to bank hard and dive, narrowly dodging debris as they tried to keep their sights on the enemy. From below, anti-aircraft batteries pounded the sky, sending up flak bursts that hit the formation. 2 Shidens were shredded mid-air, spiraling earthward in black smoke trails, but the rest pressed on. Locking on to a Hellcat squadron, one Shiden pilot rolled and dropped into a dive through their formation. Cannon shells ripped through an F6F, tearing it apart immediately. the surviving Hellcats scattered, desperate to evade the Shidens, now circling them like sharks. As the Hellcat pilot attempted to conduct a rushed landing, he lost control during his final approach, crashing as his comrades watched helplessly. By the battle's end, 8 Hellcats were destroyed at the cost of 6 Shidens. But the fight had only begun. In the days that followed, the Shiden Kais kept the hunt going. Vicious dogfights unfolded above the islands, with American fighters either blown out of the sky or returning so battered they were scrapped the moment they reached their carriers. Though many Shidens were hit in these battles, the tide was shifting. For the first time, the downing ratio began to even out. By late winter, it was estimated that the 343rd had downed over 50 American aircraft in the region. At last, it seemed Japan had unleashed a fighter that could eradicate the aerial dominance of America for good. Rewriting history. One of Japan's last hopes in the war was to break the constant American bombing raids, and with the Shiden Kai, Imperial officers believed they were closer than ever to achieving this. The mighty B-29 superfortress, while bristling with defensive guns, had not been built to face agile predators. Against the Shiden Kai's savage speed, razor-sharp handling, and cannons, any superfortress caught alone would be taken down from the sky before it had a chance to scream for help. The stakes were high. If Japan could disrupt the bombing campaign, even for a moment, its crippled industrial machine might recover just enough to churn out fresh waves of fighters. Armed with bigger squadrons of N1K2J Shiden Kais, Japanese forces could finally launch a larger counteroffensive. Suddenly, carrier-based raids against islands near Japan would be severely challenged, with American Hellcats and Corsairs going against a rival that could outturn them, outroll them, and strike with unmatched precision. Hundreds of US fighters would be lost. But there was one fatal flaw in Japan's strategy. The B-29s cruised high above the strike zone, at altitudes where thin air strangled the Shiden Kai's engine, sapping its power with every 1,000 feet climbed. Even if pilots were able to make their way up to these heights, their aircraft struggled to keep up, leaving them sitting ducks for the superfortress's defensive gunners. If they managed a firing pass, there was little chance of following the bombers home. The enemy remained maddeningly just out of reach. And so the bombs kept falling, hammering Japan's fragile war industry. The production of new Shiden Kai slowed to a trickle. Desperate for anything airworthy, Japan's leaders had no option but to keep the obsolete Zero, years behind the latest American designs, going into mass production, simply because it could be built faster. By the final months of the war, it didn't matter if Japan had one of the most lethal fighters in the world under its command. The pilots aboard the N1Ks knew that each mission was a final stand for honor, not for victory. Endgame. In the end, it was a numbers game, and America's industrial superiority was simply too overwhelming for Japan to counter. For every George or Shiden Kai Japan could send into the skies, America answered with squadrons. And while Japan barely managed to put a new generation of pilots through the most basic training, America flooded the Pacific with waves of fresh, fully trained commanders. These pilots now held the experience, tactics, and numerical edge to press the advantage. As these new waves of American airmen swept forward across the Pacific, the George and the Shiden Kais met them head-on in a series of vicious, isolated dogfights. Victories were still possible, and when they came, they were spectacular. But they were fleeting. The unstoppable tide was rolling in, and no amount of bravery could turn it back. The Japanese command made one final desperate decision. If their dwindling squadrons of fighters could no longer halt the enemy, perhaps human sacrifice still could. Pilots were no longer trained for mastery, but for martyrdom. Officials ordered cadets to climb into the cockpit, point the aircraft at the enemy fleet, and not return. Japan's last surviving fighters were now flown by men with barely the skills to take off, armed with nothing but willpower. The Americans were stunned as they watched waves of Japanese planes dive from the skies, their pilots willingly surrendering their lives to deliver one last strike. It was the final, desperate convulsions of a dying empire. By August 1945, the final Kawanishi N1Ks were grounded for good. After months of bitter, hopeless fighting, the war ended as 2 atomic bombs shattered what little hope remained in Japan. The Shiden had failed to defend Japan against the Americans. In the end, only 1,532 units were built, and of those, just around 400 were the more advanced Shidenkai models. Today, only 4 Shidenkais remain, preserved in museums around the world, where visitors can gaze upon their sleek frames, knowing they're looking at the ghost of what almost became the fighter that allowed Japan to reclaim the skies over the Pacific.